What if the person you loved more than anyone was permanently changed by dementia and you became their caregiver? Well, your relationship would change, and you would change too. I'm Aaron, and I'm currently full-time caregiver for Diane, my wife of nearly 30 years. She's living with advanced Lewy body disease. I started the Diane Project to tell stories about our journey. Some stories are about the past. Some are about the here and now. I hope you get something from them. Today I'll be reading a 3-part essay that was originally posted to Substack titled, "This is Kansas Day." It's been adapted for audio. The Substack version includes links, images, and videos. I'll link to that in the show notes, or just visit thedianeproject.com. When we were dating in the early 90s, Diane lost the central vision in her left eye. This can happen with high myopia. At the time, she was a senior editor at an educational publishing firm in Evanston. Vision loss could be both personally and professionally devastating. So, when an eye surgeon proposed scarring the macular tear with lasers, of course she said yes. Those procedures proved to be not only excruciatingly painful, but quite useless. The only positive takeaway from the ordeal was that it seems to have convinced Diane that I was the real deal. She was a 50-year-old divorced mother of 2. I was her 28-year-old boyfriend. This couldn't possibly last. "You won't want to be married to an old woman," she predicted. Wrongly, it turns out. Hadn't I driven her to every eye appointment? Hadn't I sat in the room as she endured those laser procedures and then waited on her hand and foot afterwards? In traditional wedding vows, 2 people say they will have and hold each other in sickness and in health. That's a caregiving pledge. I had made good on my end already, and in due time she would return the care. Of course, being a modern couple, we couldn't just do the traditional vows. We also wrote a vision statement. I think we must have copied some of these lines out of a Harville Hendricks book. Here's a sampling. "We build each other up, support and affirm each other, and are always there for each other. We live without needing to be in control. We stretch each other's minds and areas of understanding. We laugh a lot. We give each other grace and the benefit of the doubt. We help each other achieve our dreams." To our credit, we took these promises seriously. Every so often we would pull out that 1-page vision statement and review how we were doing. Sometimes we might even flip the page over and read these goals that we tacked on at the end. "We have both found a voice, an audience, and a deeply satisfying purpose for our writing. We collaborate on writing projects." I'm sure we put these at the end because, at the time, they were purely aspirational. Diane was revising a book for an educational publisher in Wisconsin. I had a secretarial job and a late-night TV newsletter. I mean, sure, it would be great to compose deeply satisfying works together. But what? How? I don't think we had a clue. Eventually, Diane returned to work with her one wobbly eye. She also took out a sort of insurance plan. She attended classes at night and on weekends to earn a certificate in massage therapy. After we got married, I moved in with her and almost immediately asked to quit my desk job and try my hand at freelance writing. I had that newsletter. It earned no money. I wrote once a month for the Village Voice. I had a couple of contacts in journalism. So this was a very nervy ask on my part. Still, we help each other achieve our dreams, right? She said yes. And 15 months later, the Kansas City Star came calling. They wanted to hire me as their television critic. Paid move, 401k, health insurance, the whole shebang. Now, I'll be the first to admit that writing about television was never deeply satisfying work for me. But I was good at it, and we both felt the propulsive excitement about my burgeoning career as my byline appeared in ever more prestigious publications, including 2 sections of the New York Times. They flew us both to Kansas City, and while I interviewed at the paper, she drove our rental car around town. She looked at the nice neighborhoods that my editor had told us about, and the East Side slums that he hadn't. Afterwards, she gave me permission to upend our world. It was November 1996, and it was the last time I remember her driving a car. As we were preparing to move, Diane lost the central vision in her other eye. She had been assured years before that macular tears very rarely happened in both eyes, and now she couldn't see 5 feet in front of her. One doctor in Chicago proposed a Hail Mary, radical surgery on both eyes to remove the blood vessels that were occluding her central vision. This would require complete immobilization for 2 weeks, so great was the risk of retinal detachment. Diane tentatively agreed to the surgery. She lined up friends to help with meals and such, since I had to get to Kansas City to start work. But she also found a doctor in St. Louis who was a renowned specialist in rare conditions like hers, and sent him her chart for a second opinion. One day the phone rang at my desk in Kansas City. I picked up and heard someone in a low voice talking rapidly. Realizing it was the doctor in St. Louis, I grabbed a pen and began taking notes. He said, "In my experience, some patients see a short-term benefit from these surgeries, but long-term, their outcomes are no better than patients who do nothing, I'm sorry to say." I called Diane with the news. She sounded relieved. But here she was, legally blind, moving to a strange town, couldn't drive, couldn't look at a screen. She had agreed to leave Evanston after 20 years, leave friends and family behind, all so I could lead the ink-stained life. She was genuinely thrilled for me, but there had to be moments when Diane saw the unfairness of it all. And yet my wife is nothing if not resilient and resourceful. Besides, you don't tell a woman with nutritional healing and your body believes every word you say on her bookshelf that nothing can be done. One day, I think she was in a health food store, Diane found this book on eccentric viewing. This technique, also known as peeking around the blind spot, is based on the idea that if central vision shuts down, the brain can be trained to see more with the periphery of the eye. Up until then, we had both assumed that her vision problem was an eye thing. This book was asserting that it was a brain thing. If you've read Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself, you know that the unlimited plasticity of the adult brain is one of the great scientific findings of the past 50 years. But it wasn't until about 20 years ago that clinicians started doing studies to see if rigorous training could help patients remap their eyesight after vision loss. What I'm describing to you now happened a decade before that. This New Age book on eccentric viewing had a bunch of eye exercises that Diane was supposed to do, and she did them every day for hours until she had to lie down and put a cold compress on her eyes. But in a few weeks, she was able to use her computer again. She put a large text magnifier on her desk, supersized the fonts on her screen, and kept bright reading lights around the house. Her eyesight never was fully restored. The way she always described it was to turn to someone and say, "I can see you, but I can't make out your face." Still, she was able to pass for a sighted person and resume her regular routine. The human brain is amazing. Back when we were getting friendly, not yet dating, we bonded over history. I would go over to her house for dinner, and then we would watch Ken Burns on TV. So when we moved to Kansas City, it seemed natural to learn about the area by visiting its museums. One fine day, we drove out to the Wyandotte County Museum, hidden away in a park at the edge of the metro. We walked through the permanent exhibit, which was mostly archaeology, and then we wandered into the lonely corner that every county museum has, with the community room and a huge stash of donated things. Here is where we found the table with some handmade displays, one of which featured a laser-printed picture of a woman that appeared to be from the 19th century and a paragraph explaining who she was. This was Diane's introduction to the woman who changed her life. Her name was Clarina Irene Howard Nichols, and we learned that she lived in Wyandotte County in the 1850s and 60s. She had been a newspaper editor in Vermont who counted as her friends Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was an early figure in the woman suffrage movement that started at Seneca Falls in 1848 and became a popular speaker on the circuit. Then, in her 40s, she left it all behind and moved her family to Kansas Territory. Clarina Nichols was a woman on a mission. Charming herself into the male-dominated politics of her time, she helped secure for the women of Kansas the most liberal set of reforms anywhere in the Union. She was memorialized in the early volumes of woman suffrage history. And then, like everybody else not named Anthony or Stanton, she was completely forgotten. Judging from this homemade display, Clarina Nichols was even a footnote in Kansas history. Diane was also a woman on a mission experiencing upheaval in midlife, and she wanted to know more about this kindred spirit. She tracked down the museum's director, John Nichols, who was working that day, and began to quiz him. A soft-spoken Kansan, John Nichols, no relation, said he had created the display on Clarina Nichols because, in his opinion, she had been unjustly overlooked. Sensing that Diane had more than a passing interest in this pioneering feminist, John showed us to the archives room and introduced her to Steve Collins. A professor at the nearby community college, Steve was there working on his index of the Quindaro Chindawan, a newspaper that Clarina Nichols wrote for in 1856. Steve told us that there had been a scholar who had gathered Clarina's local writings and published them in the Kansas Historical Quarterly in the 1970s. This man was said to be working on a book about her, but had since passed away. By the end of their hour together, these two men were urging my wife to write the biography of Clarina I.H. Nichols. We started with weekend trips to the state archives in Topeka, working through their slim collection of texts and microforms related to Clarina. Research trips became our favorite form of travel. Besides serving as her driver, I read any texts that she couldn't, and I helped double our productivity at archives, which in those pre-digitization days had to be visited in person. Diane acquired and read through volumes of the Kansas Historical Quarterly, including the 8-part series of Clarina's writings compiled by the late Joseph Gambone, the would-be biographer. Next, we set off in our Honda Civic for a research trip to Northern California, where Clarina spent the last 14 years of her life. When I told my editor at the newspaper what I was doing with my 2 weeks of vacation, she asked if Diane would write a profile of Clarina for the Sunday Arts section. This would be the first summation of her work thus far, and would appear in a newspaper that was read by 1 million people. And this led to a discussion between Diane and me about how she would sign that article. When we married, our pastors had introduced us as Mr. and Mrs. Barnhart, and she began using my last name professionally. But I didn't like the idea of her appearing in the Kansas City Star as Diane Barnhart. I didn't want readers to think I was the reason she was getting published. That was Clarina's doing, and hers. One option would have been to use her first husband's surname professionally. That, in fact, is what Diane's sister had done after her divorce. But my wife had no interest in that option. So that left the name she was born with, Diane Eichhoff. Oh, the places that name would go. Diane and I were excited about our first research road trip, a 2,000-mile excursion to Mendocino County, California. That's where Clarina Nichols is buried and where she spent the last 13 years of her life after deciding she was better off there than in Kansas. Clarina had spent 1864 and 1865 in Washington, D.C. She and her daughter Bercia served as clerks in the Treasury and Army Quartermaster departments. They replaced men who went off to fight. Clarina also went through the revolving door of matrons at the Troubled Colored Home, run by the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children. Mother and daughter returned to Kansas and found their beloved Quindaro all but abandoned. Many of the town's buildings had been torn down for firewood by Union troops who camped there during the war. Then, in 1867, Clarina's male allies abandoned her. That year, the legislature put two measures on the ballot that would have altered history by giving the vote to women and blacks in Kansas. Susan B. Anthony led a parade of national suffrage leaders to Kansas to help Clarina campaign for the measures. But leading Republicans backpedaled on their early support, and both measures were soundly defeated at the polls. In her final 4 years in Kansas, Clarina turned away from politics. She divided her time between farming, caregiving, and keeping up with the women's movement from afar. Her youngest son, George, married a Wyandot Indian named Mary Warpole. After Mary fell ill, the task of raising their 3 children fell to Clarina. Then her daughter Bercia accepted a marriage offer from a Civil War general and moved back east. Besides breaking her mother's heart, Bercia left Clarina in charge of a sickly teenage girl named Lucy that she'd brought home from Washington. We only know this from a single letter that Clarina wrote to her daughter-in-law in 1871. But this letter gave Diane more pause than anything else in her research. From what Diane gathered, Lucy was living at the colored home when Bercia took pity on her. Her mother says that she, quote, wept and begged to take the girl with them. Clarina was opposed, but she relented after Bercia pleaded with her, saying that she just wanted someone to love and care for. But once Bercia was married and had a white stepdaughter to care for, she simply left Lucy behind in Kansas. Clarina was none too happy about being stuck with this sullen teenager. She wrote in her letter that the child had seemed so white and pretty at first, but she now saw Lucy for what she truly was, quote, a natural-born thief and a liar, adding, I shall get rid of her as soon as I can. Clarina was hardly a saint among women, but this letter seemed way over the top for her. It troubled Diane a long time. She wondered how Clarina could lash out that way, especially since it was her daughter Bercia, not Lucy, that she should have been mad at. Rereading the letter through caregiver's eyes, though, I have a new perspective on it. It was her last year in Kansas. Lucy had been living with her for 3 years. She had likely contracted a chronic illness at the colored home, which was notorious for its filth. One matron found the children, quote, 80 in number, and not 10 healthy ones in all, and not one free from the most disgusting parasites. In her letter, Clarina reports having to nurse Lucy through a long illness after Bercia's departure. Even when healthy, Lucy would have been a handful for an older woman who herself was not in the best of health and was caring for George's sick wife and 3 grandchildren as well. Correspondence was Clarina's lifeblood, the way social media is for some people today. She wrote constantly, sometimes for publication in newspapers, sometimes to stay connected with allies in suffrage, and sometimes to unburden herself. Always mild-mannered in person, Clarina could complain bitterly to a far-off friend or relative about low pay for a speech or a sexist insult or the physical ailments bothering her at that time. To me, the simplest explanation for the Lucy letter is that she wrote it when she was at the end of her rope. Anyone who has ever been an overwhelmed caregiver or has had to delete a tweet should be able to relate. The woman that Clarina unburdened herself to in that letter was her daughter-in-law, Helen, who is living in Northern California. Helen and Clarina's son, Aurelius, lived there with their family. He had a successful photography studio and a newspaper. I've always loved the story of how Aurelius met his wife, Helen, and now that I'm a caregiver, I love it even more. On her first homestead, Clarina counted among her neighbors old John Brown, the God-fearing abolitionist. This was the time of Bleeding Kansas, a period of intense lawlessness among pro-slavery and free state settlers that served as a backdrop to the political struggle that was tearing the nation in two. In 1854, Kansas Territory was opened to white settlement. Pro-slavery Missourians flooded into Kansas and stuffed ballot boxes in the first elections, resulting in a pro-slavery legislature. Franklin Pierce, a Northern president who relied on Southern support, turned a blind eye to the shenanigans. Then came May of 1856, and 2 events that triggered John Brown. First, the Free State capital of Lawrence was sacked by pro-slavery forces. The very next day, abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner was savagely beaten on the floor of the U.S. Senate after delivering a fiery speech on Kansas. Old Man Brown and his sons lost their minds. They went at night to a settlement of families on Pottawatomie Creek who were said to be allied with the pro-slavery cause, called the menfolk outside, and attacked them with broadswords, killing 5. After the massacre, a posse led by a deputy U.S. Marshal went looking for John Brown. His family quickly pulled together a militia of sympathetic neighbors. Clarina was out east. She was settling the estate of her late husband and stumping for the Republican Party, so she wasn't there to stop her 2 oldest boys, Howard and Aurelius, from joining John Brown's militia. The Free State men surprised the federal posse at Blackjack, near Lawrence. The resulting skirmish is now considered the first ever military battle over slavery on U.S. soil. On that day, the old man and his militia prevailed, and John Brown was never charged in the Pottawatomie Massacre. But in the fighting, Aurelius took a bullet and limped to a nearby cabin for help. With his mother absent, the McGowan family, who lived in the cabin, took in Aurelius and cared for him during his long recovery. Specifically, 18-year-old Helen McGowan cared for him. The 2 got married in 1857. By then, Aurelius, Helen, and her parents had decided they'd had enough of Bleeding Kansas. They joined a wagon train to California. Clarina had written that letter about Lucy to her daughter-in-law, Helen, in California. She was overwhelmed with the demands of care, needed help, and was ready to move somewhere that she could get help. And by the time she wrote that letter in 1871, a transcontinental railroad existed that could carry her and her family to California in less than 2 weeks. Later that year, Clarina, George, Mary, and their children, but not Lucy, boarded a third-class rail car and headed west, arriving in Ukiah, California on New Year's Day, 1872. Later, George's wife passed away. This left Clarina, who is by then crippled by rheumatism and bothered by chronic bronchitis, to raise her grandchildren. She would homeschool them from her bed. She would say, "I am a cheerful invalid." Clarina also contributed a chapter to the monumental History of Woman's Suffrage and kept up correspondence with her Eastern allies until the last days of her life in 1885. Aurelius and Helen's daughter, Grace, would become a renowned regional painter and Ukiah's leading cultural figure. The Grace Hudson Museum, begun in her 1911 Craftsman bungalow, later expanded into a large modern gallery, contains the family archives. Museum staff were at work on the first ever permanent exhibit on Clarina I.H. Nichols when we reached out to them in 1999. A few weeks before our planned road trip, Diane felt a lump on her breast. She'd had cysts before, but this one worried her. Diane's doctors weren't sure what it was. A harmless cyst? Maybe a small carcinoma? Once again, Diane sought a second opinion, and this time all paths led to Amy Jew. A surgeon beloved by a legion of breast cancer survivors, Dr. Jew agreed to look at Diane's tissue sample. We packed our bags and awaited the test results. A call came from the hospital. The tissue tested negative. We high-fived, jumped in the car, and drove to California. One afternoon, I left Diane at the museum and went to a phone booth to retrieve our answering machine messages. There was a message from Diane's doctor. He sounded nervous. "Yes, if Ms. Barnhart could call us back right away," he said. The next message was from Amy Jew. She wanted Diane to call her back. Oh dear. The hospital hadn't bothered to check with Dr. Jew before calling us with their "it's negative" report, and it seems Dr. Jew had a different opinion about the tissue sample. So Diane's doctor had gone into CYA mode. When we got home, there was a certified letter from the hospital with the same message left on our machine. On the drive back to the museum, I decided I wouldn't tell Diane about any of this until we had left California. I had been in the room for all of her doctor visits. I knew that the lump, tumor, cyst, whatever, it wasn't aggressive. I also knew that Diane had a 99+% chance of survival if she had it removed. Telling her now would make no medical difference, and she would want to cut her research trip short. At the very least, she would worry about it until we got home. Sooner or later, every cognitive caregiver learns to play fast and loose with the truth. There's even a high-sounding phrase for it: compassionate deception. People with dementia can't regulate their feelings. If I say the wrong words, Diane might have a meltdown. So I'm selective in what I disclose. Of course, you should be as honest as you can with your loved ones, but there were many occasions over 30 years when I needlessly stepped on my wife's feelings. I told her on the way home, and Diane thanked me for not telling her sooner. Dr. Jew removed the lump, and then, while she was recuperating in the hospital, Diane informed me that she had edited her last textbook. This wasn't a request. She had said yes to me without hesitation when I asked to quit my job, and she knew I would do the same for her. From then on, it was all Clarina all the time. The following summer, we entered the race for the cure. Like most of the 100 or so women on Team Amy, Diane opted for the 1-mile fun walk through downtown Kansas City. I joined her. At one point, Diane challenged me to a foot race. We set a target, a block or two down Pershing Road, and sprinted toward it. And I lost, badly. We had a good laugh at how out of shape I must be to get boat raced by my wife. It was only months later that we looked back and saw what we couldn't see that day. A man in his 30s of ordinary fitness should have no problem keeping up with a woman in her 50s of ordinary fitness in a short sprint. That fall, we loaded up the car and headed to Vermont. The trip to California was a classic pre-digital age archive dive. We spent most of it in one room inside a modern museum. Vermont was more like living history. The house where Clarina Nichols was raised over 200 years ago was still standing on the village square of West Townsend. The family that was living there invited us in for a tour. They knew who Clarina was. The church that the Howard family attended and where 17-year-old Clarina Howard took her year of extended schooling was still there. Outside the church were historical markers for Clarina and her cousin Alfonso Taft. His son, William Howard Taft, would become a U.S. president. Over in Brattleboro, we found the building where Clarina's second husband, George Washington Nichols, published the Windham County Democrat. By the end of its run in 1852, the newspaper was being edited by his wife. George was too ill to continue the work, and the paper had separated from the Democrats over slavery and women's suffrage. We met members of the Townsend Historical Society who were Clarina's biggest boosters and treated us like VIPs. And we stayed with Lynn Blackwell, who was working on an academic biography of Nichols and had shared valuable research finds with Diane. Afterward, we drove to Massachusetts to see friends. I can still remember the completely exhausted feeling I had after hoisting my luggage up to the top floor of their townhouse. My head spun. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something was up, for sure. And yet, just before our trip, we had visited the clinic at the hospital, the same hospital that had whiffed on Diane's lump the year before. A third-year resident had looked me over and declared that I was a perfectly healthy male with a lot of earwax. He never did a blood test. On a Friday night that November, we attended a Kansas City Star gala at Union Station. The next morning, around 5 a.m., I awoke with a 104-degree fever. I tried getting out of bed, but could hardly stand up. Our neighbor drove us to the ER, where a doctor immediately triaged me to a bed. My spleen was the size of a football. "You look like you're pregnant," Diane had commented earlier. Someone tested my blood and found that I was out of platelets, out of hemoglobin, out of neutrophils, the white blood cells that fight off infections. The ER doctor told Diane that it looked like leukemia. Fortunately, testing later that day revealed that it was a chronic form called hairy cell leukemia. A frontline chemotherapy had been developed a few years earlier. According to the oncologist who treated me there, it was 90 to 95% effective in wiping out hairy cell leukemia. Great news, except that I didn't fit the profile. The typical hairy cell patient is a man in his late 50s or early 60s. I was 35. It seems my relative youth made my disease more resistant to frontline treatment. The chemo did nothing for me except make my whole body break out in a burning rash. Diane found a Chinese medical practitioner in the area who treated me with acupuncture and herbs. I searched the scant online medical literature as I waited for my oncologist, a grim fellow with an on-brand mustache, to get back to me. Finally, he said he would perform a second round of the failed chemo. Also, he wanted me to know that he disapproved of Chinese medicine. That did it. Diane reached out to her brother-in-law, a gerontologist in New York, who offered to find the leading hairy cell clinicians around the country and ask their opinion. None of the doctors he spoke with thought a 35-year-old patient should be getting a second round of the failed chemo. Armed with this information, we confronted my doctor, knowing that it was likely our exit interview. He wouldn't budge. Next, I met with a respected hematologist who had a large private practice in town. He said there was a trial underway at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. It would be perfect for me, and he offered to reach out to a colleague there. Okay, but how was I getting to Houston? Commercial flight is a dicey proposition for someone with zero immunity. Then Diane said she knew a couple of Minnesota farmers with a Cessna plane. Her brother Donald and his son Stephen said they'd be honored to transport us to and from Houston. After the first round of treatment, I did the rest of my infusions in Kansas City. The clinical trial was a success, but it would be several months before it was safe to go out into the world, so I quarantined on the third floor of our house, and Diane took care of me. It's hard not to look back at this give and take of dependency, taking turns as the household breadwinner and the caregiver for the other, and see that it was the most powerful determinant force in our marriage, like children are for other couples. Would Diane have made her midlife pivot if I wasn't there for her? Would I have gotten my dream job, or had the nerve to leave it 15 years later, if not for her love and support? While I convalesced upstairs, my legally blind caregiver managed to crack out a draft of her Clarina Nichols biography. She titled one of the chapters, "Woman on a Mission," which could just as well have described herself. For years, Diane had been writing and editing for younger readers. She was familiar with the dreary monotony of women's history titles available to that audience. A biography of this Western feminist would be a welcome addition to the young adult market. But that first draft showed her the limits of the YA format. Much of her research simply couldn't be used in a short book with a fast-moving narrative. And forget about endnotes. Who did those in YA? Diane realized she had higher aims for the first ever biography of Clarina Nichols. She wanted to produce a complete work of scholarship aimed at a general audience. And already there was an audience forming. After Diane's article appeared in the Kansas City Star, she had received an invite from the Kansas Women Attorneys Association to be the featured speaker at their state convention. That introduced a new challenge. Although Diane had retrained her brain to rely on peripheral vision, she still wore thick glasses and hovered close to the computer screen. That was fine in the home office, but my wife was not about to read a prepared speech to a room full of attorneys holding the pages up to her face. The only option was to memorize the speech, which she did. A 1-hour talk on Clarina Nichols, committed to memory and flawlessly recited. Once she cleared that hurdle, the world was her oyster. The human brain is amazing. And now we come to my favorite twist in the story. Diane, age 60, takes up acting. And this chapter also began with a museum visit to the small town of Lecompton. On the day we were there, they were holding Lecompton Days with carnival rides, local bands, and a Bleeding Kansas reenactment. As we arrived, we were greeted by a serious-looking reenactor. He was dressed not in a uniform, but in the gentlemanly attire of the era, which in Kansas often included a weapon protruding from one's boot. "Excuse me," Diane asked the man, "is that a Bowie knife?" This was our introduction to Tim Ruis, director of the historic site at Constitution Hall, built in 1855 when Lecompton was the pro-slavery capital of Kansas Territory. As we learned in Part 1, Kansas history buffs know a prospect when they see one, and within minutes Diane had an invitation from Tim to speak at the site's annual Bleeding Kansas lecture series. It was the first of many invites to Lecompton over the years. Upstairs at Constitution Hall is a unique venue steeped in politically incorrect history. Besides the whole slavery business, the Klan used to meet there in its Rotarian heyday. The Bleeding Kansas series kicks off on the last Sunday of January with a Kansas Day program. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Kansas Day, or the importance of January 29, that was the date in 1861 when Kansas was admitted to the Union after much delay and turmoil. Kansas Day is not an official holiday, but it might as well be. Every year, buses of children descend on Topeka to tour the magnificent State House and gawk at the 20-foot-high mural of John Brown. In classrooms across the state, students read stories of Bleeding Kansas and learn that the state motto, ad astra per aspera, means to the stars through difficulties. This lofty Latin phrase was coined by the Free Staters to celebrate their triumph. In the end, neither guns, nor election fraud, nor the Dred Scott decision, nor two pro-slavery presidents could defeat demographics. More people from the North moved into Kansas than from the South, and Northerners were generally anti-slavery, though few shared John Brown's magnanimity toward black people. Congress refused to act on the 1859 Free State Constitution, which meant that Clarinda and other Kansas women had to wait for their rights. It took the election of Abraham Lincoln, the secession of 7 states, and the expulsion of their representatives from Congress for Kansas to become the 34th state. Diane's interest in Clarinda Nichols soon became known to Tim Ruis's friend Howard Duncan. Howard extended an invite to join his troupe of historical thespians known as the Lecompton Reenactors. Since I was along for the ride, he invited me too. Bleeding Kansas was indeed bloody, but mostly it was a war of words fired from the mouths of politicians and the pages of the partisan press. Howard Duncan created the Lecompton Reenactors to bring the Free State-Slave State struggle to life with monologues delivered by real-life characters on both sides. They entertained audiences by haranguing and dunking on each other while telling the story of Bleeding Kansas. Howard, who wrote the monologues, gave me a script that he'd written for a pro-slavery minister named Thomas Johnson. He wrote a Clarinda Nichols script especially for Diane, who was not especially thrilled with it. After some negotiations and a rewrite, she agreed to join the Lecompton Reenactors. I had a lot of fun playing a slave-holding man of the cloth. As for Diane, she had stage presence from the get-go. She was dipping her toes in the acting waters and finding that she enjoyed it. But she never liked that script. She wondered, why can't I just use the actual words of Clarinda Nichols? Soon she would get the chance to do just that. The Kansas Humanities Council announced that it would stage a Bleeding Kansas Chautauqua in the summer of 2004. Inspired by the traveling Chautauquas that toured the Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Humanities Council would bring a historical roadshow to towns across Kansas. They were looking for people with both academic rigor and dramatic flair, since they would be giving talks by day and performances by night. The council was casting 6 roles: Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Senators Stephen Douglas and David Rice Atchison, and to offset all that testosterone, Clarinda Nichols. Diane had never acted before Lecompton and had only recently begun taking graduate classes in history. But I knew this was her moment. I told her there was no one who knew Clarinda Nichols better and could bring her to life on the stage. I can't recall if Diane had any reservations, but if she did, she got over them fast. It took her 1 week to write a 30-minute monologue in which Clarinda tells her story in her own words. It took her a little bit longer to memorize it. Next, she needed to film an audition tape. As it happened, Professor Steve Collins had asked Diane to appear on his community college's TV station to discuss her work. I reached out to the TV show's producer, who agreed to stay after the interview and film Diane's audition. When we got to the studio, we found that the equipment was so old that everything was still being filmed in black and white. How perfect was that? Diane did the scheduled interview, then changed into her costume, transformed into Clarinda, gave her performance, took home 2 copies of the videotape, mailed one to the Kansas Humanities Council, and waited. Hey, it's Aaron, and I'm interrupting myself for an announcement about the Diane Project. This is the final episode of Season 1, and I'm excited to announce that in Season 2, the Diane Project will become a podcast only. As you may know, I started doing this as a newsletter, but after a few issues, I began recording an audio version of the newsletter. And I have to say, it's taken this project to a whole new level. Many of you have told me how the audio connects emotionally with you. Wait till you hear the end of this episode. So I'd like to make a request of you. If you're not subscribed to the Diane Project, please just take a moment and do it right now. Go to your podcast app and click subscribe, or subscribe at thedianeproject.com. I've already started work on Season 2, and we're going to take some journeys I think you'll want to be along for. We'll look at the surprising history of dementia research and why Diane's illness was basically ignored for 50 years. Also, what's missing in the media coverage of Alzheimer's? And what did the pandemic teach us about caring for those with cognitive loss? I'll share stories about caregivers like me and how we not only weathered the storm, but found a new gear. Season 2 will be enhanced with interviews and sounds that you can only do on a podcast. Now, if you're already getting the newsletter, no sweat, you don't have to do anything. You'll still get a newsletter with the audio file attached and a transcript so you can read along if you want. The podcast apps will also have the transcript. So please make sure you're subscribed and stay tuned, because I'll be sending out some post-Season 1 extras that you won't want to miss. Subscribe on your podcast app or visit thedianeproject.com. Thank you so much, and thank you for all of your comments and messages of support this season. I really appreciate it. And now, the conclusion of This Is Kansas Day. It's a blustery early spring day in Chicago, but as soon as I click on the video, I feel warmer. I'm transported to that summer night in 2003 outside a charming old house in Topeka. The house belongs to Ron and Annette Thornburg, one of the more prominent couples in the capital city of Kansas. There are people standing in clusters, chatting pleasantly on the Thornburgs' front porch. The video footage is unsteady. I'm on the lawn trying to figure out my new camcorder, which has more buttons than a Shakespearean costume. As I take a few shaky establishing shots, I hear a woman's laugh above the chatter and think, I know that laugh. Inside the house, people are holding drinks and talking in groups. And moving among them is a tall, friendly lady in a black dress whose badge identifies her as Marion Cott, director of the Kansas Humanities Council. These are her people: donors, board members, allies in government. Originally from Iowa, Marion has spent 30 years building the KHC into a force for good in her adopted state, promoting civic values and lifelong learning. It awards dozens of grants a year in support of small-town and rural-friendly projects, oral history, film festivals, educational talks. KHC's big initiative in 2003 was a traveling exhibit titled Produce for Victory: Posters on the American Homefront. But tonight is about a much more ambitious project that's launching next year, 2004. And like the Diane Project, it has my wife at the center. Since the 1980s, the KHC has sponsored the Kansas portion of the Great Plains Chautauqua, a 5-state roadshow that mixes enlightenment with entertainment. It features a traveling band of scholars who give talks during the day and perform as historical characters, Sacagawea, Teddy Roosevelt, etc., at night outdoors under the big top. To mark the 150th anniversary of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 2004, Marion wanted KHC to have its own Chautauqua. This one would shine a light on the often overlooked role that Kansas played in the lead-up to the Civil War, as I described in Part 2 of this series. Diane applied for the part of Clarina Nichols, and despite her lack of scholarly background or acting experience, the KHC chose her. And tonight, she's starring in a VIP preview of the 2004 Bleeding Kansas Chautauqua. We're doing it at the home of the Thornburgs because Annette is on Marion's board and is married to the Kansas Secretary of State. Ron was elected to 4 consecutive terms as a moderate Republican, back when those creatures roamed the earth. You would never know this is Diane's performance debut. I mean, there she is on the front porch, minutes before showtime, just yakking with folks like it's a charity event for St. Francis Hospital in Evanston, where she was the director of public relations in the 80s. All of her familiar qualities are on display. Her smile, attentiveness, good humor. But what people probably noticed is the incredible 19th century period costume she has on. The wig, designed with the ringlets that Clarina wore in her hair. The dress, inspired by New England styles of the day and made for her by a Lawrence quilter and dressmaker. Once everyone goes inside and is seated, Diane is introduced by Marion. She delivers a half-hour monologue crafted from Clarina's own writings. She answers a few questions as Mrs. Nichols, then takes off her wig and answers questions as Diane. The video is posted to the Substack version of this story. The Bleeding Kansas Chautauqua kicked off in Junction City the first week of June 2004. Most of our family attended that one. Next up was dusty Colby, Kansas, all the way out west. Then historic Fort Scott in the state's southeast corner. The finale, which played to the biggest crowds, took place in Lawrence's South Park, near the University of Kansas. Each site was treated to 5 nights of performances. College professors Fred Krebs and Richard Johnson debated amicably as Lincoln and Douglas. David Rice Atchison and John Brown, a.k.a. Dave Dickerson and David Matheny, each got his own night. Charles Everett Pace breathed fire into Frederick Douglass's 4th of July address. Diane's performance in Lawrence was memorable, and not just because the tent was filled to capacity. In the audience was Janice Parker, a direct descendant of Clarina Nichols, whose grandmother Diane had interviewed for her book and had told Diane that her name was pronounced Clarina, not Clarina. Janice brought a very special heirloom with her, the brooch that Clarina wore in the 1843 picture that I featured on the cover of Diane's biography titled Revolutionary Heart. Diane wore it for her performance that night. The book came out in 2007, and with support from the KHC, Diane kept doing her one-woman show. The demand seemed endless. It wasn't easy for Diane to put on a period outfit, perform a script from memory, and take questions from audience members she couldn't see because of her poor vision. And yet, I'll bet she did it 100 times. Had Marion Cott not retired and the KHC put an end to the Living History program, Diane would probably be performing in that wig and dress until her diagnosis. Well, she probably wouldn't have made it quite that far, but that's a story for another day. She had a new master's degree and the tools of historiography, so she went into the history business. The humanities councils in Missouri and Kansas wanted relevant talks on history. The pay was enough, and we could sell books afterwards. Over the next 15 years, with me as her driver and later as her partner, we covered most every highway in 2 states. Diane gave different talks over the years, but they always had something to do with women's struggle for basic rights or the roles of women in the Civil War era. These topics were not only novel and interesting to her audiences, but they gave Diane an excuse to work Clarina Nichols into every single talk. After I left the newspaper in 2012, we became a writing-lecturing team, leading Osher Institute classes, addressing Civil War roundtables across the Midwest, and even once appearing on C-SPAN. We published books on local history and women in the Civil War, and we were working on our most ambitious book project when it all came to a sudden stop in 2020. It was Louis, not COVID, that put us out of business. Diane's diagnosis forced us to drop everything and pivot to downsizing and moving. We never gave another talk, and we shelved our work in progress. By the time we arrived in Evanston in 2022, Diane had forgotten that she was the one who had given Clarina Nichols her place in history. But turns out there was someone in Kansas who hadn't forgotten Diane. I received this email out of the blue last November. Hello, my name is Phyllis Pease, and I am the artist that is working on the Kansas Suffragist Memorial. Clarina is front and center of my painting, and in my sketch I have her wearing the memorial brooch. Would you happen to have a better photo of it? Having no idea what this suffragist memorial was, I searched online and learned that it was a project of the Kansas League of Women Voters, at whose convention Diane once spoke. The memorial was actually an 8 by 19-foot mural that an artist named Phyllis Garibay-Kuhn had been selected to paint. The mural would be permanently installed on the first floor of the Kansas State House in Topeka, 2 floors down from one of the most illustrious murals in America, John Stuart Curry's tragic Prelude, famous for its 20-foot-high, hair-on-fire portrait of the abolitionist John Brown. I could only find an early sketch of the mural titled Rebel Women. There was Clarina holding a lamp, leading a legion of suffragists. It had the feel of a traditional, overstuffed historical mural with a bit of comic book flair, but it also had a special quality. It seemed so joyous. Even in rough draft form, it made my heart leap. Tears welling up, I sent Phyllis a photo of Diane wearing Clarina's brooch. Phyllis wrote back, "Oh my gosh, Aaron, this is a great picture. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. I've read all of Revolutionary Heart. I think Clarina is an amazing woman. And if I could go back in time, that's who I'd want to meet." Now I wanted to know all about this mural and the woman bringing it to life. So I got Phyllis on Zoom with Diane sitting next to me. I asked her why she introduced herself to me as Phyllis Pease when she was planning to sign her painting Phyllis Garibay-Kuhn.
So I got divorced several years ago, and I haven't officially changed my name back to my maiden name because it was in the State House. And my parents are Kansans, and his family is from Nebraska. It just kind of prompted me to I want to honor my family. I wanted to honor both my parents because they went through a lot to be married because it was a mixed marriage. My mom's Mexican. She immigrated when she was a child from Michoacan, and they ended up in Kingman County and farm. They're both farm families. He's German, Scotch, Irish. They moved from Illinois. That's the other thing. It was a mixed marriage because my mother was Catholic, but my dad was not. My mother passed away several years ago, but my dad's 100. So he is still alive and kicking. And that really a wonderful story of these two people that met and got married and had 10 kids and farmed. My mom was just the fire, So my dad, quiet. He's just every day he's asked my sisters, how's the painting going? What's going on? I'm so excited for Wednesday. So that's why I changed it. And I'll start signing my art that way too.
How did this project come about? How was it commissioned? And then how were you commissioned?
The League of Women Voters and the AAUW. It goes through the state, but it's all privately funded. League of Women Voters made the proposal and they were granted the space. They put the net out for artists, and they wanted Kansas artists. I've done one big painting at the zoo here, Sunset Zoo, and I have a painting at Kansas State University, and I love to paint big, and it's kind of nostalgic, inspired. I had not heard about this project. I don't know how they advertised it, but not well enough, because they didn't get enough input. And so they extended the deadline. a woman came into our small business. They have a little bakery and a restaurant and said, "Hey, your mom should do this project." So I applied and they narrowed it down to 5 artists. And then each artist had to present their idea. And they gave us a list of like 20 women, and there's a snippet on each one of them. Of course, Clarina is on the first page. So I read Revolutionary Heart. And then after I started reading about Clarina, I said, oh, she's a freaking superhero. She is the one in
Yeah.
front and center. There was a guy he teaches at KU, and he's like a heavy hitter. And I'm like, I can't believe I'm up against this dude. But one, he's a dude. And the League of Women Voters were like, we really want a woman to paint this painting. I kind of got a peek of some of the other people's ideas. They kind of focused on nationwide suffragists, a general story, as opposed to the
big
Kansas
mistake.
women. Anyway, so I did the research. The preservation committee chose me to be the artist with changes. They didn't have a problem with my composition or what I had in it. And I had Lawrence burning. I had the territorial capital, the border wars, because Clarina's sons fought in the border wars. So that was great. I said, okay. And I was a graphic designer. That's what I graduated and worked in a firm. And so I understand, design by committee. And I expected, there to be some changes. We worked together to choose the women, but they always wanted Clarina to be featured in the project.
Phyllis's painting has dozens of people in it, but in the front are 13 women. About half of them are arranged in a superheroes Avengers flying wedge, with Clarina Nichols at the forefront. These women were chosen by the Memorial Committee for their contributions to the Kansas suffrage movement between 1859 and 1920.
There's a plaque that will sit underneath the painting, and there will be a key, but it will number from left to right each of the suffragists, and it has their name, what town they were from. And what's cool is like these are people that existed in time. They have hundreds and hundreds of kids come there, through there every day. Teachers and
It's going to be fantastic.
The tour guides are so excited. Well, I was just there for a while, hours. The tour guides, every one of them would stop and say, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to now come down this hall and talk about these women. And they were already rearranging their tours in their head. And one of them said, I'm going to have to cut something out. I know exactly what I'm going to cut out. So she can make it to that hallway.
Rebel Women was unveiled by Governor Laura Kelly on Kansas Day, January 29th, 2025. Phyllis's sisters were on hand, but her 100-year-old father never saw the finished mural. He had passed the day before. I had yet to see the finished mural, so I began hunting for images online. One search led me to the website of Kansas Public Radio's KPR Presents, hosted by Kay McIntyre. When Revolutionary Heart came out, Kay had dedicated an entire episode to Clarina's story and had interviewed Diane. Ahead of the Kansas Day ceremony, Kay interviewed Phyllis, and she took a photograph of a portion of the finished mural that was included on the page with the podcast. In the photo, Phyllis is standing in front of Clarina Nichols and pointing at a detail. There was the brooch and something else that hadn't been in earlier photos: the knitting needles. This was Diane's favorite detail from the 1859 Free State Constitutional Convention. Clarina attended every day and sat in the press section, and she brought her knitting. A New York Times reporter sitting next to her wrote this line that Diane loved to quote: "Mrs. Nichols sits at the reporter's table every day, some of the time plying her needle, some of the time her pen." Imagine sitting in a smoke-filled room of shouting Republicans and Democrats, and then, during a lull in the action, hearing the click-click of needles. Diane loved that detail, and so did Phyllis. The moment I saw this picture, I felt overwhelmed. As I listened to the podcast, I just stared at that picture on my screen and sobbed helplessly. Diane held my hand tightly, in silence. I know I have put forward a cheerful and somewhat brave face during this season of the Diane Project. It's not an act. Well, it's not an act any more than Diane performing as Clarina Nichols, a woman with whom she deeply identified despite the century and a half between them, any more than that was an act. This person I've been speaking as, this is who I am now. I'm a manly caregiver. In my experience, women and men have distinct ways of projecting strength and assurance. Diane and I complemented each other. At times, I put a little steel in her spine. Other times, she tamed this bull in the china shop. I'm perfectly comfortable now taking my wife to church every week and parking her wheelchair in the front row. I've gotten pretty good at talking about Diane's dementia and making care for her sound as natural as any other family activity. I'm not a hero any more than any other human who was conscripted into the army of caregivers. Several dads I know have kids who were born with special needs. We can relate to each other. I would like to see more men lean into caregiving roles. They can handle it better than they think. Also, I believe that having more men take on the responsibilities of care instead of looking for the nearest available woman would be a huge cultural shift for the good, and we need one of those right now. Having said all of that, I must admit that my description of life as a manly caregiver has not been complete. We must now talk about the hardest part of the job, which is the emotional part, specifically grief. It's been 3 months since I first set eyes on Phyllis Garibay-Kuhn's inspiring mural, and it still reduces me to tears. I can't look at it or even think about it much without watering up. This isn't the "so proud of you" trickle tear that rolls down the cheek when your loved one is recognized for an achievement, though it did make me mighty proud to see Clarina front and center, leading the Avengers. No, I'm crying because I'm grieving. And I've been grieving a long time. Watching Diane go through all the changes the first 2 years after her diagnosis was hard. In real time, I lost not only our partnership, but eventually I lost her companionship as well. Elissa Strauss, the author of When You Care, whom I interviewed in my first issue, interviewed me for CNN.com about caregiver grief. The takeaway of her story is that caregivers often have no choice but to deal with their emotions while at the same time doing their best to care for a loved one. That describes me to a T, but until I read Elissa's story, I hadn't really looked at it that way. So then, I began thinking more about the role of grief in my caregiving journey. As you've followed me on the Diane Project, you've seen how I relish the challenge of caregiving. It gives me a sense of accomplishment to do right by my baby. But if I think back over the past 3 years, there have been many moments when I've been alone and heard a sad song on the radio or found myself awake in the wee small hours and surrendered to my sorrow. I looked back at my story about Soup Club and realized, oh, hey, there I am, coping with my grief in very practical ways. I'm turning off the news to avoid piling on the pain. I'm making new friends, rebuilding my social network so I can regain some of the emotional support I lost when Diane got sick. Then there was my story, This is the KISS Test, where I quoted caregiving coach Pat Snyder telling me that after this journey,
you're going to be able to love more deeply, have much more compassion, because you had to.
Pat and I didn't talk about grief, probably because I didn't want to. With the Clarina mural, though, the walls of resistance came crashing down. That led to this 3-part Kansas Day series on my wife's midlife reinvention. I knew I couldn't write about my grief without giving you a sense of all that I lost. By now, I hope you understand why I said in the opening lines of the Diane Project that she is the woman to whom I owe everything, and why I am glad to be her full-time caregiver for as long as it takes to give her a safe and gentle landing in the next dimension. My friend Rick Hudgens wrote a good reflection recently on grief and grievance. He notes that men who act out in anger are usually avoiding their own pain. By confronting pain, we experience grief, and grief is the necessary antidote to the poison of grievance. We are all capable of addiction to grievance, Rick writes. We must remind ourselves regularly that loss is constant and universal. He's right. I could just as easily have avoided the pain and spent those years in a state of anger over the unfairness and cruelty of cognitive illness. I know some male caregivers who have anger issues, and all I can say is, there but for fortune go I. It certainly worked to my benefit that this wasn't my first rodeo. My caregiving journey with Diane spans the course of a long and fruitful marriage. Indeed, that through line of mutual care is one reason why our marriage has been long and fruitful. For how much longer, though? On Palm Sunday, I told our faith community that we are transitioning Diane to hospice care. I told them that not much was changing, that everything will stay home-based, but now I'm getting some extra and much-needed help. The truth, however, is that things are changing. I still go in for the kiss test, but her kiss is getting weaker. I look in those tired eyes, and I hold that hand with its still, strong grip. She's hanging on, but I can feel that still, strong grip loosening. I think this will end beautifully for her, but I'm going to be a wreck. I've decided to take a break from the Diane Project. We'll call this the Season 1 finale. I plan to return with Season 2 in the fall. In the next 4 weeks, I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to celebrate my 60th birthday and our 30th wedding anniversary. And I'm going to Kansas for a grandson's high school graduation. And I will visit the State House in Topeka to see rebel women in person. I will bring tissues. Don't forget to subscribe where you get your podcasts. Please visit thedianeproject.com. If there are any major developments on the home front, of course I will pass them along. Until next time, take care.